army operating in Ukraine. And this army took part in the shooting of a number of left-wing people and a number of Jews. And Mr. Roman Shukhevich has been declared by Mr. Yushchenko a national hero of Ukraine. Even Karl XII of Sweden, which fought Peter the Great in the beginning of the 18th century, is somebody very close to the heart of Mr. Yushchenko, and he loves him very much and dearly, and he wants to erect a monument to Karl the 12th on the territory of Ukraine because Karl fought the Russians. So with such an approach, we cannot say that Ukraine is just a victim of Russian plots and so on. There is a big part of the Ukrainian political establishment, not the whole of it, but a big part, which hates Russia their guts. And we cannot trust people who say, we will not have bases, military bases on our territory, because words are just words. We have a declaration signed by NATO about military bases, and they are still being established on the territory of new member states. Yes. Shortly about Georgia. I know that 75% of Georgians are for entering NATO. So I suppose that it's up to NATO basically to decide this issue. I don't think that Georgia entry into NATO will generate a lot of passions in Russia. NATO should decide whether it is wise to have a country which has a very controversial history for the last 15 years and controversial history from the point of view of stability, and the border issue was mentioned here and so on. I think it's up to Georgia and to NATO. Whereas Ukraine is different. It's different because Mr. Rybatchuk did not say that he represents the minority of the Ukrainian population and that the referendum is not being conducted by Mr. Yushchenko in Ukraine, because the referendum would give a negative result by the population of Ukraine if they are asked whether Ukraine should join NATO or not join NATO. I always thought that a referendum in a democratic country, which Ukraine is, would be probably the most democratic exercise which should show whether a country wants to join a military organization or it wants to be dragged into this organization by a part of its political class. We have to recognize that there is a difference here. And I think that the majority of the Ukrainians will not buy this idea. And that's the reason why the referendum has not been conducted yet. Because otherwise, if it was so wished by the Ukrainians, as Mr. Rybatchuk has said, that 50 million Ukrainians want to be part of NATO, they don't. Part of them wants, but it's a majority. If they really wanted to join NATO, Mr. Yushchenko would have conducted a referendum and say, look, 60% want to be, okay, 52% want to be members of NATO. And Russian position would have been very much weakened. But as it is not the case, of course, we are on the side of those who sympathize with those who are against Mr. Yushchenko on this issue. So I think that we cannot play down the public opinion here. It's a very important issue. And by the way, George Bush, on the summit of NATO in Riga 2 years ago, he said, we would like very much to have Ukraine in NATO, but we also would like to have the majority of the Ukrainians want the same thing. And that's the only essence on which I agree with Mr. Bush. Yes, so wrapping up, I want to say that this is about wisdom. And I don't think we should resort very much to these things that Russia is breaking the international law. What about Kosovo? Who was the first to break international law and to divide a country which is a member of the United Nations with recognized international borders? You know very well that it was a break of international law. So double standards don't work anymore. If you want double standards, then we play double standards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexey. It is about double standards. It's not about rights, but it is about wisdom. It is not about democracy, but it is about security and strategic concerns. Summing up, finally, for the motion is Giorgi Kandelaki, Member of Parliament, of the Georgian Parliament in Tbilisi and Deputy Chairman of its Foreign Relations Committee.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I'd like to first thank Mr. Pushkov for two things. First, because he admitted that 75, but in fact 77% of Georgians voted in favor of joining NATO on January 5th this year in a referendum. And secondly, because he said that the only reason why Georgia shouldn't be allowed into NATO is controversial history. That's a great argument. Thank you very much. Then if controversial history was an argument, would Germany ever be allowed into NATO? I don't know. Few clarifications, since Sweden was mentioned and that there is already ongoing debate in Sweden with regards to joining NATO. It's also going on in Finland, and in fact, Finnish Foreign Minister Alexander Stubb, since Finland is portrayed as sort of model of good relations with Russia, has initiated, in fact, debate and spoke in support of Finland joining NATO. Well, in order to sort of answer the question behind the motion today, I think we have to understand the motivation of why Russia went into this war with Georgia, why Russia invaded Georgia. Our opponents would argue that that was sort of a response to encirclement of Russia. That would be it was a response to, you know, post-Cold War humiliation and so forth. Our opponents still pretend that they believe that it was Georgia who first launched this conflict in South Ossetia, despite the mounting evidence that it did not. Well, I'm sure that most of us would agree that if NATO was not enlarged to Eastern Europe, if NATO did not include Poland and the Baltic states, that Eastern Europe today would be a much bleaker place, that there would be less reform, less prosperity, less democracy, and you know, we would face democratic failures, democratic breakdowns, possibly. In short, Eastern Europe would be an easier peace for the resurgent regime in Moscow. What is Russia telling to the West by invading Georgia? That message is clear: stay away. That is ours, to put it simply. But what is Russia telling to its so-called near abroad is also clear, and that is, going democratic is dangerous. Democracy is dangerous. That is the message that Russia is sending to us and to all other countries in the neighborhood. Is it really NATO armies that Russia is afraid of? Russia can never withstand a conventional war with NATO. American Navy can sink Russian Navy in a day at maximum. What Russia is really afraid of is more democracy and more freedom at its borders. Indeed, Kremlin Inc., or the government that calls collapse of the evil empire greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, cannot not be afraid of freedom and democracy. Well, should we abandon our ambition to become democratic and free? Or we should call for setting up an international mechanism to deal with the psychological problems of states? I don't have an answer to that question. I'm not saying that Georgia should be admitted to NATO today or tomorrow. Georgia has surely a lot of work to do. But why Georgia needs membership action plan is precisely because we need the admission process scrutiny to overcome the problems that we have, because the admission is not only about military reform, not only about civilian control of the armed forces, but very much so about sustainability of democratic institutions that Georgia is trying to build. And in fact, in case of Baltic states, many problems that many sort of kinds of criticisms that we hear towards Georgia was very much heard towards the Baltic states. And with help of this scrutinies of NATO and EU admission, those problems were solved, and Baltic states moved ahead. As a Georgian, I know very well how far we have gone since the Rose Revolution, since when Georgia was a failed state, when Georgia was one of the most corrupt countries in the world. From that, from being number 130-something in terms of business attractiveness, according to the World Bank, Georgia has just become number 15 in the world. Georgia has become, according to the EBRD, least corrupt economy in Eastern Europe, or according to the Transparency International, with all the criticism towards its methodology, least corrupt country in the former Soviet Union, except the Baltics. Of course, we are very much proud of our police, that our police was basically organized crime, which it is in Russia. We fired all of it, and we built a non-corrupt, professional, and polite police, which was unheard. Is that, Mr. Pushkov, what you're afraid of professional, non-corrupt police probably, because that was, I'm sure, one of the reasons why Russian thugs in South Ossetia